What is up, you guys? It is Monty, and today I am back again once again with the start of another video. This is my February wrap-up, but I read a nice number of things last month. I read 13 books, which is 2 more things than I read in the month of January. I actually had a really good reading month, I think. I gave January a 4 in terms of like my overall reading. And while I'm not sitting here averaging, I would also say that my February was pretty solid. In February, I said this during my Stephen L. Carter vlog intro, but I attempted to vlog every day in the month of February. And if there wasn't a vlog, there was a video that made up for the vlog not being there. And I did some reading sprints every week for the patrons. So that's all over there. It's all alive and living. But here for y'all today, I'm going to attempt to wrap up the things that I didn't talk to you guys about, in addition to briefly discussing my Stephen L. Carter addiction. So without further ado, rather, let's get into it. So I'm low-key very ashamed that the first book that I finished in the month of February was Spare by Mr. Henry of Windsor. Yeah, I read his little autobiography, his little memoir, if you will. I started this in the month of January, and it was one of 3 things in January that I wanted to finish before the month was over because it wasn't written by a Black person. Obviously, I failed at that endeavor. But overall, I actually did have a really good time. A little bit of a backstory. In January, I actually started a reading vlog where I was going to toss out my planned reading for the month and read Spare alongside some other books. And those other books I never even looked at, never even set foot on like my fingertips on the page or whatever. But I did start reading Spare, and so there's also a reading vlog of me reading this, full thoughts in the moment, a little breakdown when I was done, over on the Patreon. But generally speaking, I did give this book 5 out of 5 stars. A lot of this memoir was about his time during his military service in Afghanistan, which I would not have guessed going in based on, headlines that were about and all that kind of a thing. And while I don't want to get too much into it because like I said, like the vlog is over there, it's behind a paywall for a reason, but I did appreciate his insight into his military service era. I went into this book expecting it not to be him deconstructing, the monarchy in general or his role within it and how that has broader implications. I did not go into his memoir thinking it was going to be a takedown of the family that has fucked him over. I did go in thinking that it was going to be Harry telling me his life in his own words, and that's what I got, which is why I think I appreciated his reflection on his time in Afghanistan, because I do think that all the things that he has been through, it's his like his military experience that he's actually been to therapy for and has had the longer term how do I want to phrase this? I think that the memo makes clear that he has worked through that time of his life in a way that he has not necessarily worked through other parts of his life yet. And he's still relatively young. I think he's like 36 or so, to where I do think that if he were at like 68 or 79 or whatever to publish another book, he might then have had time to look back at his family and talk about the things that people might have gone into this expecting to get out of it. So there's that. So the next book I read in the month of February was The Battle Drum by Sarah L. Arifi. And this is the sequel to The Final Strife, which last year I read that book first time, gave it 4 stars, sat on it, thought about it, downgraded it a little bit. Then I agreed to reread the book for a readathon moment that I want to say fizzled, but definitely fizzled. So I reread the book, and at that point I think I gave it 2 stars. Everything I liked about The Final Strife happens like from the 80% mark onward. It's really just how that book ends that I find fascinating. Not so much the competition aspect, not so much the sapphic romance that I went into that book expecting to get it, because for a large chunk of that book, it's just giving heterosexual. So I was excited a little bit to get into The Battle Drum. I did request it specifically because it was by a black author. It was by, a black Brit. And it takes some inspiration from the Middle East, and I think she was actually born in like the United Arab Emirates, and it incorporates a lot of different parts of the diaspora into this book, and I was excited to continue to support them. Ever since the Poppy War trilogy, I'm very hesitant to like read books one. Like I gave both. To cut to the chase, I gave the Battle Drum 2 stars, which is why I bring up the Poppy War, because I gave the first 2 books in that 2 stars, and then I gave the conclusion 4 stars, and I've gone on to give Yellowface and Babel both 5 stars. And R.F. Kuang is a person that I appreciate the writing from now. And so the Battle Drum, I feel like, could follow that same pattern. My issue with the Battle Drum is that the world that we are in, it explodes. It explodes in the Battle Drum. And part of it, I think, it explodes in terms of scope, but I also think our understanding of the world, like how we know the world to function, also a little bit explodes. And I'm not entirely certain that everything that is revealed makes a lot of sense. Like I'm not sure how it makes sense, and I'm a little confuzzled. I'm a little confused. um, so it was interesting. It was definitely interesting, and I will read the final volume. I will see how the Burning, I think it's called like the Burning trilogy, the trilogy of Burning. Is it on this little book cover? Let me see here if I pinch to zoom. Book 2 of the Ending Fire trilogy. It's the Ending Fire. Burning's not even in it. But yeah, I'll see how it goes. Could be good, could be bad. We'll find out together. The third book that I read was Promised Boys by Nick Brooks. And this I gave 4 stars, partially because it was written by a black person. Not gonna lie, because I think it's a 3-star book that I felt comfortable rounding up. I just felt comfortable rounding up on Goodreads. So here we're following 3 perspectives. And the reason that I say it's probably a 3-star book that I was able to round up is that it's like 200 and some odd pages. Let's just round up to 300 pages, right? 150 of those pages is entirely set up. It's like it takes place before the principal is murdered. It's establishing our 3 characters. And then for the last 150 pages, it's seeing the after effects and finding the actual murderer. And it was fun. I enjoyed it for what it was. For a thing, like if you were at home and it was a rainy day and you just had nothing but time on your hands and you had completed all your housely duties, you didn't have to like cook or clean or take care of a pet or an animal or a child. A pet and an animal is the same thing. I don't know why I said it twice. And you could just read this book. It would be fine. It would be a day well spent, a nice little afternoon. But the actual story, the narrative, the writing, it was fun. And I did read it in one sitting. I read it on some reading sprints with the patrons. So like it felt good. It felt decent. None of those 3 characters that we followed were memorable. What actually happened in the book, here I am sitting down like a month later, hasn't stuck with me, but I was entertained at the time. And I do think that if a teenager were to pick it up and read it, I think they too would be entertained. And that's all I could ask from a book that short, is to be entertained. So it did what it needed to do. Here we are now going to start getting into the love affair that I had with Stephen L. Carter. And the first book I read by Stephen L. Carter was The Impeachment of Abraham Lincoln. This is a book that I was excited to get to because of one, it was a courtroom drama, which is still an aspect of the thriller universe offshoot landscape that I think I appreciate in book form. I love a good legal show, so I feel like a legal book right up my alley, right? So here we are following what happens if instead of being assassinated at Ford's Theater, he survives that attempt, and a couple years, I think it's 2 years later in the book, might be like a year and a half later, Congress decides that they are actually going to bring articles of impeachment against Abraham Lincoln, which is something I think they attempted to do against his surviving vice president. I don't know. It's addressed in the author's note of the book, but apparently The like impeachment of Abraham Lincoln is something that is debated in historian circles, which is also something I'm getting from the author's note. And so Stephen L. Carter said, you know what if I did this? What if I wrote a fictionalized account of this? And here we're following Abigail Canner, who is a black woman who has just graduated from Oberlin College. And she's coming to Washington, D.C. to get a job at the law offices of the people who are going to be defending the president against the House managers. And on one hand, I did appreciate seeing Abigail Canner trying to carve out space for herself in the society and doing some of the investigations and getting into some of the things that she was getting into. On the other hand, I really did expect to see her be a lady lawyer, and she didn't really get to be a lady lawyer. It was a lot of her fighting against the things that were keeping her down. And for a book called The Impeachment of Abraham Lincoln, you do have to read several hundred pages before we even get to the impeachment trial. So there's a lot of investigating. There's a lot of Confederate espionage conspiracies still at play, even though the Civil War is over. But overall, I had a good time. This is definitely not a Stephen L. Carter book that I would recommend anybody start with, and it's not a Stephen L. Carter that I think is even universally appealing. It was just a good time for me personally based on interest that I came into the text already having. So if it's an idea, if it's a premise that sounds interesting to you, I say it could be up your alley. But I would also say that none of Stephen R. Carter's books are actually all that fast paced. I wouldn't call them thrillers, even though some of them have like thriller. Like if I gave you the plot synopsis, you could be like, oh yeah, you could fit that into a thriller. You could fit that into like an action adventure novel. But they are all more like slow moving, deeply meditative texts about characters that find themselves in these um vast conspiracies that that are here to take somebody else down. The next Stephen L. Carter book that I picked up that I actually would recommend to most readers was Back Channel. And here we are in the 1960s. It's set right before the Cuban Missile Crisis and like right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, essentially. But here we're following our it's a college student, Margot Jensen. And Margot Jensen is at Cornell University. She's trying to get into politics. She's like a politics major or something to that effect. And she's like just going along to get along. She has this one professor who was involved in World War II as a spy master. He was like leading a ring of spies. He was connected to the State Department in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And it comes to be that they being the State Department is running this what how do we they have this intelligent asset, and this intelligent asset is going to go on this mission. But in order for him to go on this mission, he is saying, I actually want Margot to be there with me. I only trust Margot. Margot has to come if you want to use me to do this. And so the mission is he and the intelligent asset they have is this world-renowned chess player, Bobby Fischer. And so Bobby Fischer is going to this chess championship in Bulgaria, and at this previous chess meet or whatever, a Soviet player had approached him and said, "Hey, the USSR is going to be putting nukes in Cuba. Thought I would let you know." Or he didn't say that exactly, but he said, "Hey, I have some information," and that information ultimately would be we're putting nukes in Cuba. But Margot Jensen is approached because her boyfriend is actually friends with Bobby Fischer. They grew up on the same block, so they've had some interactions. And it's then when they're in Bulgaria, come to find out, Bobby Fischer was like, "Yeah, I didn't actually ask for you to be here. The State Department just said you had to be here, so you're here." And so once again, we have Margot Jensen at the center of this vast conspiracy where the USSR is going to put, nukes in Cuba, and only she can stop the nukes from getting into Cuba with the help of this Soviet person who was also like, "Yeah, I don't want the nukes to be in Cuba either." And this, I think, is probably one, the most fast-paced Stephen L. Carter book that he has written, and two, the Stephen L. Carter book that I would recommend to most readers because I think that it's the most universally appealing because, again, it is the one that is most fast-paced. In a lot of his books, things are happening, but they don't really feel like things are happening. It just feels like characters are learning new information. But Margot Jensen is constantly in a state of, okay, I'm a college student. How the fuck am I supposed to do this? Like, she's a college student who gets apprehended by the like Bulgarian CIA and is like, okay, I've been trapped by the Bulgarian CIA and I have had no training. And when I went on this mission, the State Department told me that I was on my own. So, like, how am I going to get out of this? And then you have to see her try and get out of it. And then later on in the book, she has these more information. She's like, okay, I have all this information, but like, I'm a college student. What am I supposed to do with this? And it was just fun. It was a fun time. It's the one I would recommend to the most people. There's two Stephen O. Carter books that I think are for everybody, and Back Channel is definitely one of them. 5 out of 5 stars. It was a brilliant time. The next book that I have on my little graphic that I shared on Instagram is Transcendent Kingdom by Yagasi. I did not like this book. I think I hated this book about as much as a person can hate a book. I gave this 2 stars. And I'm going to be very honest. I gave this book 2 stars for one major reason. So here we're following a woman whose family is from Ghana. Her family being her mother, her father, and her older brother. They were all like born in Ghana, from Ghana, and they moved to the state of Alabama. First it was her mother, and then her mother brought along her father, and then eventually, or it might have been like the mom and the brother, or it was the mom and then she brought along the father and the brother. Whatever events happen, the family winds up in Alabama, and they do make friends with some other, Ghanaian immigrants, and they have this collection of Ghanaian people that they are surrounded by. But they live in the state of Alabama, and they don't have any other black characters in the book. I'm not a Ghanaian immigrant. I don't want to speak, to the immigrant experience, but it just felt very strange to me that I felt a very distinct lack of black characters in this book. And it was kind of a plot point where there were all these white girls at the church that they went to, but there were just no black people. There were, I think, like 2 black boys on her brother's basketball team at some point, or might have been the football team. He does play sports as a child, or his soccer team. He plays soccer and basketball. So on like one of those teams, there might have been a couple of black people at some point, but there's no there's no black people in this book for a book that is set majority of the time in the state of Alabama. But the book is also told in this fashion where it's our main character looking back at her life and how her life has been, or how like America has like fucked up her family in terms of the religion, in terms of where they were, in terms of like racism. Eventually, we do get a black character in the book in the form of a love interest who refers to Africa as the homeland, which I do think is weird. Not gonna lie, I think it's weird, and like, Black Americans are like, oh yes, the continent, the entire continent of Africa is the homeland. But our main character was like, bitch, what do you mean? You don't have any, you can't claim Africa. You're not from Africa. I'm from Africa. My mommy is from Africa. I went to Africa and I lived with my auntie. And it's just like, okay, yes, he's weird, but you are also being very weird right now. And it did not move my spirit. So all of the, the talks of, family and addiction and religion and coming to terms with things and moving through them and healing and the journey of everything this book tried to do, just it did them. It was fine. I got through the book, but it's not a book I would recommend to people. And I do think that if you are going to go into it, just do know that there are some like really heavy topics in terms of drug addiction, in terms of deconstructing your religion, in terms of parental abandonment. A lot of things are happening in this book that are heavier, and it's not a light read by any means. After the kind of flop that was Transcendent Kingdom, I said, you know what? Let me go back to my boy, Stephen O. Carter. Because, the first 2, 4, 5 stars, obviously, is a hit, right? And that could not have been further from the truth. Because the Stephen O. Carter that I decided to pick up was his debut novel, The Emperor of Ocean Park. Here, again, the premise sounds like it's going to be a banger. We're following the death of Judge Oliver Garland, I think that was his name, and he at one point in time was going to be on the Supreme Court. He'd been nominated, but he ultimately withdrew his nomination because of an association with a person that was not the best. He had to, at one point moved, I think he was like the head of the CIA at one point, or he was in the State Department, but he was also believed to have murdered his wife. And so it was discovered that Judge Oliver Garland had been taking off the book secret meetings with him in the courthouse where he was an appellate judge, a federal appellate judge, on one of the circuits. I think it was the DC circuit. And so he was there, and it was just, it was not a good look, as the kids say, you know? And so he pulled his nomination. This is, like, you know, way back, and like, it was at some point, I think it was like, it was during the Reagan administration because Nixon had appointed him. Reagan had nominated him for the federal, not for the federal, but for the Supreme Court. Because it was at a time where Thurgood Marshall was on the court, but we had not yet gotten to Clarence Thomas. So Clarence Thomas was a Bush era, first Bush era pick. Anyway, I don't care about the history of the Supreme Court justices. So here we're following his death, and his daughter thinks that this man was murdered because in the time since he was nominated to the Supreme Court, he had started doing these little private talks for these wealthy Republican people, and he was something of like the original, you know, I was canceled by the libs, the radical left is out to steal the country, and it's only good black folk like me that can take it back. And our main character here, Misha, he goes by Misha. He has a different name. His name is like Talcott, but no one calls him Talcott. So Misha is out here thinking that his sister is a little crazy. Like, obviously, their dad was not murdered. But again, because it's the Stephen L. Carter book, our character, and it's again vaguely thrillery, our main characters find themselves at the center of a conspiracy that doesn't seem to like really fit together. And Talcott is kind of exploring, kind of investigating, but also is like, this shit don't make sense. This shit ain't really real, but I'm going to try to get to the bottom of this nevertheless. So ultimately for me, because I'd already read two really good Stephen L. Carter books and I could see how he had grown as an author, this one was a solid 3 stars for me. It was a solid 3 stars. You know, he did what he needed to do. When this book came out in 2002, though, apparently it spent 11 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, which is wild because, one, I don't think it would be there today, and two, I don't really know it needed to be there. I don't think it needed to be there even in 2002. But it is what it is. I do think that if you are enjoying Stephen R. Carter, then there's something here for you to enjoy because, again, a lot of his books are these slow-moving, meditative looks. And I think that it's different than the mystery thrillers that we're getting today, which, again, like this book is 400 some odd pages. A lot of his books are super long, like 400, 500 pages. I think Back Channel is 4, but the impeachment might be like 600 pages. So these are like bricks, okay? Like these are chunky boys, not like these little 300-page mystery thrillers that you're supposed to speed through on an airplane ride. Like, Stephen R. Carter really wants you to sit with the characters and think, because it just be pages of text. It just be massive paragraphs. So do know that going in. I then decided, well, this is not what I decided. So originally, I was supposed to read Transcendent Kingdom and Rootless together because every month for the patrons, I let them vote. And so Transcendent Kingdom won the poll. And then I pick a book that I think is going to be complementary to the book that they chose. And so Rootless by Crystal Zara Apaya, my bad, sorry, Crystal. This book is coming out, I want to say in May, but Rootless is also about a Ghanaian woman. Not Ghanaian. Oh yeah, that was kicking my ass in February. Anyway, we are also following a Ghanaian woman. This time she had immigrated to the UK. So she was living in London. And so at the beginning of the book, we find out that she has abandoned her family. At the point in the narrative where we are, she has a daughter and she has a husband, and she has left both of them to fly back to Ghana. And her husband is at their house, at their flat, looking for her, like, what the fuck is going on? Like, did you take our daughter? Like, is our daughter still living in the United Kingdom? What is happening? And so then the book flashes back to them meeting as teenagers. So from really the second chapter on, it's really a story that is told primarily in the past that eventually catches up to the present. So we see our main character and her husband meet, we see their interactions, we get to see everything that's happening. And I also gave Rootless 2 stars. This book, at least I think I gave it 2 stars. I'm going to give it 1 star. I just did not like this book. What we ultimately find out about what sent her to Ghana was it was wild. One, her husband is trash, horrible person, but also just like okay. Um, but then like what happens in Ghana? If you are looking for a happy book, don't read this book. Don't read this book. I also feel like this book, let me check my Goodreads because I think I included some content warnings because this book is also surprisingly heavy. This is the second book because Transcendent Kingdom, the dad in Transcendent Kingdom, he bounces back to Ghana halfway through the book. And then Rootless was like a follow up. And it's like, damn, do all the Ghanans just like bounce on their families and run back to their home country? Because that felt a little weird that it happened back to back in two books by Ghanaian people that I had read. I think that On Rotation is also written by a Ghanaian diaspora author, and nobody's bouncing out of the country in that one, but like, thank God. Let's see here. Oh, and because the way this book was told in like yearly increments, at some points it just felt like I was reading an outline. It didn't even feel like I was reading a fully fleshed out novel. Again, I was reading an arc, so maybe that had something to do with it. But it felt like there was I won't say there's detail missing, but it felt like there was nothing, maybe a little bit of a flair, like authorial flair. But there was something in the text that just didn't hit all the way. But it also does not look like oh, here we are. This book has some buried gems about motherhood, not feeling ready for that, elements that felt like they were trying to shine light on postpartum depression, because that's definitely the latter half of like the second act. The kind of motivation that sends our main character back to Ghana is really about postpartum, a lot about her feelings on motherhood, about whether she was ever ready, whether she ever wanted it. Lots of that in this latter half of the second part of the book. General conversations about self-harm. There's a self-harm scene in the first act of the book that gets played on. General mental health struggles. So yes, about postpartum, but even before then, because again, there's that scene about self-harm at the beginning, and that kind of weaves its way through for the rest of the book. But again, the rest of the text around these things just was a little flaccid. Little flaccid. There's really no better word than just flaccid. It just didn't connect in the way that I needed it to connect. And so after Rootless, I said, it's time for me to go back. I need to go back to Stephen L. Carter. I need to hit some more of his backlist. And so I went for the audiobook that was readily available on Hoopla, and that was Invisible, the forgotten story of the black woman lawyer who took down America's most dangerous mob person. I don't know what the subtitle is, if I'm being honest here, but this is the story of Stephen R. Carter's great-grandmother, Eunice Hunton Carter, as she grew up. So we see her life. She was born in Atlanta, and her family moved from Atlanta during the right after there was a race riot in Atlanta, and it burned a lot of the street that they were on, not their home, but the homes around them, and they moved. So we see Eunice being born in Atlanta, then they move up north to New York City. We get a little bit of history about Eunice's mother and father because both of them were activists in their time. We learn about Eunice's great-grandparents and her grandparents. Her great-grandfather was a person who ran away from his plantation like 3 times before finally getting to freedom in Canada. Then he left Canada and came back and bought his brother out of slavery. Lots of things that are happening over there. This man is also a legend and an icon because he was with John Brown at Harper's Ferry. So that's part of the reason that he decided to stay his ass in Canada after, getting his brother. Because if I was with John Brown at Harper's Ferry, I don't think you would catch me stateside either. Just don't think it's gonna happen. So legend and icon that he was, the Carters doing all their things. But we get to see eventually, after the beginning introductory chapters, we see Eunice Carter as she starts her life at I want to say Sarah Lawrence, but it might not be Sarah Lawrence, but she goes to college She gets her little degree. She's the favored child. She's not an only child. She has a younger brother who her parents were like, just did not give two fucks about because Eunice had this like wealthy benefactor. And that was part of the reason she was able to go to college and to get through life relatively, I won't say easily, but she was able to do things that her brother had to like fight for. And there's a point in the book where Eunice and her, I think Eunice and her parents were like lifelong Republicans, even after things started to change, and you had to side eye the Black Republicans. But her brother was also a legend and an icon. He was like a Democrat before it was cool to be a Democrat, and then he got put on Hoover's watch list because he was low key a radical, like an actual radical who was like out to destabilize. And that did blunt Eunice's kind of political ambitions. But we get to see her life. We get to see her taking down this mobster, her life after taking down this mobster, the political aspirations of her. And it was really good time. Really liked it. I think if there's a Stephen R. Carter book that you're going to read that isn't back channel, it should be Invisible, because the fact that people don't know Eunice Carter is wild. Like when you start to hear about all the people that she worked with, the circle that she was moving in, it's completely baffling that people don't. This is the other thing. I feel like people know about Eunice Carter. I feel like I didn't know about Eunice Carter, but I feel like other people had to because she was just in too many circles with too many people for like the general public to not know her. I think I'm just a person who was an idiot and didn't know, but maybe you didn't either. And I think that if you don't know Eunice Carter, you are missing out because she was out here living life, doing things, being a mover and a shaker. So, still high on my Stephen R. Carter rush. I said, you know what? Let's read Jericho Falls. Or, yeah, because Jericho's Fall. No, I did it. See, the book is called Jericho's Fall, and every time I talk about this book, I want to say Jericho Falls, but the S in a different location. But Jericho's Fall is another thriller, but this one is set in Colorado at the compound of the former director of the CIA, and he was also the Secretary of Defense. And he has some secrets that he probably shouldn't have. And he has said, or put out this thing that people want him dead, and if he were to die, then the secrets that nobody wants out will also get out. And so our main character is going to visit on his deathbed, say her final goodbye. And what happens is she gets stuck on this mountain essentially with him and his two daughters who don't fuck with him because at one point she and Jack were in a relationship and it kind of broke up the marriage that he was in. And so his daughters resent her, even though it's, years later. And at the time, our main character was like an actual 19-year-old child. And so there's a lot of animosity there, but also larger implications of like, it's really not safe where she's at and she's very much in danger and bad things are going to happen. I think this is probably the one book of Stephen R. Carter's that is very atmospheric. It really does give you a sense that we are trapped here. This is one of the books that I feel like there's less meditative things happening, and there's a more it's almost back channel in the amount of investigating that is happening, in the amount of like sus things that our main character is having to deal with and juggle. So again, I didn't give this book, maybe I think I gave this like maybe like a 3.5, maybe it got rounded up to a 4. It's on the list of things that if you're going to read Stephen R. Carter, I would recommend this, but it's just not quite back channel level to me. But it might be for you. It's also a little bit shorter. It's one of his shorter books. And so if you wanted something that wasn't a nonfiction to start with that was short, this is where you would go. I wanted to get through some more arcs, so I picked up The Black Guy Dies First by Robin Means Coleman, PhD, and Mark H. Harris, I think. And this was fine. I think that the information was good. The way that it was delivered left a little bit to be desired. It wasn't quite how I would have preferred it. I do like the illustrations. I like the lists, but often I felt that the information was being sidetracked to give us a BuzzFeed level listicle about a topic that they were kind of discussing, but not entirely. And then some of the things that they included on the list, it just felt like padding to make the book longer, and it didn't feel like an actual it didn't feel like an examination. It didn't feel like an oral history. It just kind of felt like I was reading a condensed version of things that both these people could talk about. Like, the information that I did receive made it feel like both of these people knew a lot about this topic, but they weren't conveying everything that they needed, or not everything they need, but everything that they could have conveyed about the topic that they were writing about, which was weird. I also feel like this is a book that you can revisit multiple times because they definitely reference, I think, very popular movies, but also movies that I would even like the most diehard the most die-hard horror fan, the most die-hard black horror fan, I feel like I would be a little bit surprised if y'all had seen every movie that they mention in this. And so I do think that if I were to go out and watch some of these things and then come back and revisit this book, I would have another layer to interact with the text on. So I did give it a positive review and a positive rating, and I'm happy to have read it. But I think that if I'm going to continue to read on this topic, I will check out Robin Mean Coleman's other works because she has at least like 2 other books on the topic. Then I finally picked up my copy of Love Times Infinity by Lane Clark. This is a YA book that I had access to for months. It was sent to me. I had it. I think I might have even requested it, put up my name in a little sign up because the book sounded interesting, and it just took me forever to read. This book is amazing. 5 out of 5 stars. Can't praise it more enough. I did not know what I was getting myself into. I really thought I was getting into a book that had like some kind of time loop. I thought it had some kind of like where we live in the same day over and over again, but that is not what this book is about at all. So here our main character, Mitchie, is the daughter of someone who did not want her because she is the daughter of someone who was raped, and Mitchie is the child that resulted from that encounter. And so she's being raised by her grandmother, and part of the story is her trying to get into Brown, where she's struggling with feeling like adequate enough to get into Brown because she doesn't really come from the kind of family that has, Brown legacy. Then we have the storyline with her and the support group that she's in for other children in a similar circumstance to her. And I felt that it really balanced some of the school storyline with this support group storyline that also balanced really well with her other friends. I say friends, she has like one friend at the school that she goes to, and that was really balanced and really well. And then of course we have a love story happening with the new kid in town, and there's like a little bit of a class differential, but really what the book focuses on and what I really appreciated was the familial storyline with Mitchie and her grandmother, and then Mitchie really wanting to have a relationship with this mother who does not want to have a relationship with her. And I felt that the non-romantic storylines in this book got the bulk of the page time. So like we were really there was like a little bit of a romance, but it was so far on the back burner that it felt natural, didn't feel forced. And the way that it was integrated into the other elements of the story was chef's kiss, in my opinion. It just was really good. So overall, I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. Definitely a new fave. Definitely one I think everyone should read. This book has like 400 Goodreads reviews or Goodreads ratings. That's criminal. We should fix that as soon as possible. I really wish that we were not stopping. That we weren't ending the video with this low note. But the last book I read in February was Their Eyes Are Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. Because I felt that I had read some nonfiction, I had read some young adult, I had read some adult contemporary, I had read some fantasy. I'm not really a middle grade girl, so like I didn't read any middle grade, but I had hit all the other areas. And the thing that was really lacking, if you will, was a black classic. I'm not really a classics person. In general, I read maybe 1 or 2 a year, but I hadn't read any so far in 2023, and I hadn't read any Black classics. And I don't think there's really a Black classic, maybe some Morrison or something, or like Alice Walker's The Color Purple, but Thighs Are Watching God feels like textbook Black classic. And so I picked it up. I already had an access to it because of Libro FM. They gave away a copy a couple of years back as part of an anniversary celebration, so I had it. And I think as a teaching tool, is excellent. I think that there's some really inventive things in terms of writing that Zora Neale Hurston does, but from a entertainment perspective. From a I'm reading for enjoyment, I don't know. I felt that the narrative gave that we had written these pieces at separate points and had collected them into a story. And it wasn't that the story didn't flow. I just felt that it didn't feel quite like a novel. Just for me, and my biggest pet peeve is always time jumps. And I felt that we were jumping through time. And I felt that some scenes felt really well paced. I felt that some scenes felt like I could really picture them and I could place them. And other times I felt that I couldn't. I don't know. It felt again like we were jumping. And while as Vignetti, and is looking at each chapter at what was occurring through just the lens of that chapter, I was like, yes, obviously I see why this had endured the test of time, why this is looked upon as a classic, but just experiencing it alone in isolation, it didn't work for me. And I said this in my Goodreads review. I feel that there are definitely books that exist that should be read as a collective, and they have benefit from being read as a collective. And I think that Their Eyes Are Watching God is one of those books that the book is fine, but conversations around the book probably deepen things about it. And I think that if I had read a chapter and talked about it with a group of people, and read a second chapter and talked about it with a group of people, or I'd read it physically and I'd interacted with the text in a way that is just not possible when you're just one man reading a book by yourself as you listen, I might have enjoyed it more. But just in isolation, by myself, as a series of scenes, it very much felt like a series of scenes. And it felt like a series of scenes that should be taught and definitely read, but ultimately was not for me. It also did not inspire me particularly to want to rush out and read more Zora Neale Hurston. So that's a little bit disappointing because I definitely thought that it would maybe have that effect, and it didn't. So I was really sad to end the month on a bummer, but such was the case. That's all the things that I read in the month of February. Let me know down below what your best book of the month was, or maybe your least favorite if that's what you want to do. But I will see all of you guys again soon in another video. But until then, and until next time.